One of the most famous bodies on Mount Everest is thought to belong to a man named Sewang Paljor. Nicknamed Green Boots, the corpse rests on its side, with Paljor's face concealed by his fleece and his arms wrapped around his torso, as if to protect himself from the harsh cold. It's impossible not to notice his vibrant green footwear, especially since they lay in the path, forcing climbers to step over the body. Hailing from India, Paljor was one of 8 people who died on the mountain during a blizzard in 1996. Number 8. George Mallory. George Mallory and fellow mountaineer Sandy Irvine vanished from the northeast ridge of Mount Everest during the 1924 British Mount Everest expedition. They were last seen about 800 feet from the summit before they disappeared from sight. For the next 75 years, nobody knew what happened to Mallory. They just knew he was dead. In 1999, climbers discovered his body laying face down while filming a BBC documentary on the topic. His remains were remarkably well preserved due to the constant freezing temperatures on the mountain. Number 7. Lincoln Hall. The first Australian expedition to climb Mount Everest took place in 1984, with the group forging a new path up the mountain along the way. Included among them was experienced climber Lincoln Hall. He wasn't one of the 2 group members to reach the summit, but he returned to Everest in 2006 to try again. This time he made it to the top, where he spent 20 minutes before beginning his descent. Shortly into the trip down, while still in the so-called death zone, Hall suffered from a form of altitude sickness called cerebral edema, which caused him to hallucinate and become confused. He began threatening to jump off cliffs and climb back up the mountain, and then collapsed in the snow. Sherpas tried for hours to revive Hall, but the expedition leader eventually instructed them to leave him behind and save themselves. 12 hours later, another group discovered the man alive while climbing the mountain. To their shock, he wasn't only alive, but was sitting up with his jacket unzipped. He was weak, delusional, and frostbitten, but had miraculously survived the night without any oxygen. He lost the tips of his fingers and a toe, but otherwise emerged in relatively good health. Sadly, Hall died in 2012 from mesothelioma. Number 6. Frances Arsentiev. Nicknamed the Sleeping Beauty of Mount Everest, Frances Arsentiev became the first American woman to summit the peak without supplemental oxygen in 1998. She accomplished the feat with her husband, Sergei, but without the supplemental oxygen, it took the couple longer than usual to complete the journey to the top. On their way back down, the weather turned and Sergei lost sight of Frances. When he reached the base camp and realized she wasn't there, he grabbed an oxygen tank and went out searching for her. Not far from the summit, Frances had grown tired and sat down to rest. A climbing team from Uzbekistan found her weak and suffering from frostbite. She couldn't stand, so the most they could do to help her was give her a bottle of oxygen. The next day, climbers Cathy O'Dowd and Ian Woodall found Frances still alive, but without oxygen. Cathy and Ian tried to help, but they had no other choice than to leave Frances where they found her. Number 5. Hannelore Schmatz. German-born mountaineer Hannelore Schmatz became the 4th woman to reach the summit of Mount Everest in 1979. The expedition was led by her 50-year-old husband, Gerhard Schmatz, who was the oldest man to reach the top of the mountain. They embarked on the journey with 6 other experienced climbers and 5 Sherpas, or local guides. Gerhard made the ascent first with some of the other group members. Hannelore's group's turn was next, but the weather was rapidly deteriorating, and Gerhard tried to talk them out of going. They didn't listen and went anyway, and he soon received word that Hannelore had reached the summit. During her group's descent, Hannelore and fellow climber Ray Gennett became too exhausted to continue. They wanted to set up camp at 28,000 feet, but their guides cautioned against it because they were in the so-called death zone, where climbers are most likely to die. Number 4. David Sharp. David Sharp was an experienced British climber who made a solo attempt to summit Mount Everest in 2006, without any oxygen, minus a very small emergency supply. It was his 3rd expedition up the mountain, and he hoped to finally reach the peak this time. It's unknown whether he reached the summit, but he definitely at least came close. During the descent back toward base camp, Sharp was forced to camp out under a rock shelter, and nobody panicked at first. Knowing he was an experienced mountaineer, other climbers assumed that Sharp had the situation under control. But he couldn't get up to resume his journey and died near the famous Green Boots corpse that's been resting on the mountain since 1996. Number 3. Shreya Shah Chlorfine. Shreya Shah Chlorfine was born in Nepal but lived in Canada. Climbing to the top of Mount Everest was her lifelong dream. In 2012, she booked her spot on an expedition with a new company. Neither Shreya nor the company had much experience. During her training, it became apparent that Shreya would lag behind the group. She had to be taught even the most basic things. One of the Sherpas forewarned her against climbing Everest, telling her that she could end up killing herself if she tried. But Shreya was determined to accomplish her goal, and she went anyway. Shreya started running low on oxygen on the way up. In addition to the long wait time to get up and down the mountain, she spent 25 minutes at the summit, using even more oxygen, while she took pictures and videos. During the climb down, Shreya became weak from exhaustion and altitude sickness and needed to be held up by the Sherpas. She passed away at over 26,000 feet. Number 2. Scott Fisher. He first climbed Mount Everest in 1994 as part of a team that removed 5,000 pounds of trash from the mountain. 2 years later, Fisher, 2 other guides, and 8 Sherpas led an expedition of 8 climbers up Everest. Slowed down by the high number of climbers on the mountain, Fisher reached the summit later in the day than recommended for a safe turnaround. On his way back down, he grew increasingly sick, weak, and tired. When a blizzard set in, Fisher sent his Sherpa along without him, asking him to return later on with help. By the time help arrived 2 days later, Fisher was unresponsive. Rescuers put an oxygen mask on his face and went to help others, hoping he'd regain consciousness at some point. But when they returned, it was clear that Fisher was dead. Number 1. Marco Siffredi. French snowboarder Marco Siffredi was just 23 years old when he climbed Mount Everest in 2002 in search of the holy grail of snowboarding routes. With the help of 3 Sherpas, he reached the summit without any issues. He spent several hours resting and preparing for his unconventional descent, while dreary weather set in. The Sherpas urged Siffredi to set up camp and wait until the next day to snowboard down the mountain, but he ignored their advice. Siffredi was never seen or heard from again, and he's presumed dead.